The collective West has recently been dubbed the Empire of Lies. And one of the reasons why people are starting to call the collective West as such is because of the blatant narratives and fictions that are constantly being made up by its mainstream media. And as I have said many times in my previous videos, this channel is extremely critical of the ongoing media narrative, specifically on Ukraine. We've covered some of the ridiculous fictions that mainstream media has already made up about Ukraine, such as Ukraine having more tanks now than when the war began, because Ukrainian super soldiers keep capturing Russian tanks, as well as the narrative that the Russians are putting the residents of Mariupol in massive concentration camps. However, as of yesterday, April 3rd, a new and fantastically blatant lie has been created by Western mainstream media. And I am, of course, referring to the so-called Bucha massacre. This ridiculous narrative that for no reason whatsoever, Russian soldiers randomly decided to murder anywhere between 50 and 300 innocent Ukrainian civilians. And as a bit of a disclaimer, to be absolutely clear, I don't know what actually happened in Bucha. I think that it is far too early to make any conclusions, and because of the media war that is going on between the East and the West, we might, unfortunately, never find out the truth. But I am not here to speculate on what actually happened. I am here to say one thing and one thing only, and that is that the official Western mainstream media narrative, the commonly accepted narrative on this event, absolutely stinks. We've seen news articles and heard accounts of horrific events. The collective media of the West is publishing articles recounting how Russian soldiers killed Ukrainian men and then proceeded to rape their wives for weeks on end. We've seen footage published by Ukrainian authorities which appears to show large numbers of dead bodies on the ground. Many of these bodies are strewn on the streets and on the sides of roads, and for obvious reasons I cannot show any of that on YouTube. Needless to say, we are talking about horrific events. But the more one begins to think about these events and the official accounts that we are being told by Western media and by Ukrainian media, the more unlikely and implausible these accounts begin to appear. Now, I'm just going to jump straight to the point. By far, the biggest reason why this Western media narrative, this media campaign on the so-called Bucha massacre, is a blatant fiction is this. Russian soldiers were in Bucha for around several weeks. During this whole entire time, communication between Bucha and the outside world was not lost. That is to say, people on the ground in Bucha could still access the internet. Telephone lines were not cut, broadband communication was not restricted, even physical travel was not fully limited between Bucha and the outside world. In early March, we even had green corridors around Bucha, where the Russians tried to evacuate as many civilians as possible. Now, on March 31st, the mayor of Bucha announced that Russian forces had completely left the city. That is to say, Ukrainian forces had not entered the city at this time, but the Russians were gone by then. And there were no reports of hundreds of civilians of being massacred with their bodies left on the streets. And only 4 days later, on April the 3rd, did the official Ukrainian government publish all of this footage, which appears to show hundreds of recently massacred civilians lying around on the ground. So the obvious question arises from all of this. Why did it take a whole 5 days for somebody to realize that 300 people were massacred and left on the ground? Why was all of this only reported when Ukrainian forces entered the city? Why did absolutely nobody talk about it before? This is by far the biggest gripe I have with the mainstream media narrative on this event. But it is by no means the only one. The Western media campaign is obviously describing a systemic cruelty and brutality within the Russian military. That is to say, They're not saying that this is the result of a few quote-unquote bad apples, that this is just a few random Russian soldiers who are committing war crimes without orders from their superiors. A few random soldiers cannot commit a massacre on this scale. They simply do not have the physical ability to do so. It is not possible to randomly kill on the order of 300 people without anybody stopping you in broad daylight. So, thinking about this logically, it is apparent that for a massacre on this scale to physically be able to take place, there has to be an order from some superior officer. And that superior officer would almost certainly not be acting alone and making up such orders on the spot. In other words, for something like this to happen, the Russian military must have some sort of policy which allows its soldiers to target civilians. So this can't be the actions of one person. This has to be systemic on one level or another. And here one has to ask, does this look or sound like the Russian military? Does this look like the military that hasn't bombed critical military infrastructure in Ukraine, such as railroads, highways, bridges, power plants, mobile towers, all of which, by the way, are legitimate military targets, since there is plenty military gain in targeting such facilities. When Western countries go to war, and not just Western countries, by the way, when many countries go to war, they target this kind of infrastructure because it is vital to the enemy's military efforts. Railroads and bridges are required to transport personnel and equipment. Power plants are vital for military industries and wartime production. Mobile towers offer the enemy another means to communicate and coordinate their forces. And during the course of this war, Russia has not targeted any of this infrastructure, not on any significant scale, even though they, of course, have every physical ability to do so. So I have to ask again, does this sound like a military that would murder hundreds of innocent people for no reason whatsoever? Keep in mind that Russia can, at any point, fly strategic bombers over Kiev and bomb the whole city into rubble. If Russia's goal was indeed to kill as many civilians on the ground as possible, would it not be logical to do something like that? Would it not be logical to at least bomb what is the largest and governing civilian body in all of Ukraine, which is the Rada, that is to say, the Parliament of Ukraine? So why is it that while none of these targets have ever been in the Russian military's crosshairs, we're now being told that the Russians just up and went murdered over 300 innocent people? For no reasons whatsoever, other than, of course, to provide the Western media campaign with propaganda material to further demonize the Russian military and the Russian government. But that's not all. There are many more suspicious details about this story, many of which were pointed out by various analysts, investigators, and bloggers on the very first day that this was reported. Besides the previously mentioned fact that Russian soldiers left on the 30th of March, and it was reported that they completely withdrew by the 31st, while there were no burials, the bodies were not cleaned up or even so much as moved over the course of 5 days. And by the way, as I am recording this very video, I have seen that some Western media claims that these bodies were lying around not for days but for weeks, and that all of this was seen from satellite imagery, but is apparently only being noticed now. Other very curious coincidences arise in that, for example, we have not seen a single one of the alleged 300 to 500 victims in Bucha ever identified. That is, no photos of the dead body along with their documentation, along with a photo showing who they are, their first and last names, their address, none of that whatsoever. The Russians, as well as the LNR and DNR, post this information regularly. They regularly show dead enemy combatants along with their documents that identify them. Why has this not been done for a single one of the residents of Bucha? Not to mention the fact that, at least from what I have seen, There is not a single photo with any one clearly identifiable face. Pretty much all of the bodies are either lying face down or looking away from the camera, or they're so far away from the camera and are blurred out that it's impossible to tell. And perhaps it is also worth mentioning that in this famous video where we saw the Ukrainian army drive into the city on armored vehicles, many bodies were shown strewn around the streets, to the left side of the street, to the right side of the street, but not one of them lay in the direct path of the vehicle. This is admittedly circumstantial and not very solid evidence. That's why I'm mentioning it last, but it is nonetheless a little bit suspicious. Although the very last thing I will mention is this. There is such a thing as reputation. And if you blatantly lie enough times, people are naturally going to become very hesitant to believe anything that you say, even if it so happens that you are saying the truth. So when you have this collective Western media, which only during the course of the last 5 years has lied about Russian opposition leaders being poisoned with chemical weapons of mass destruction, which they miraculously survived, ex-FSB agents in the United Kingdom also being poisoned with the same chemical weapon of mass destruction and also miraculously surviving, 2 separate accounts of chemical attacks happening in Syria by a government which neither had the reason nor the physical ability to commit such attacks after destroying all of their chemical weapons several years prior, concentration camps and widespread genocides in Chechnya, then in China, now in other regions of Russia, elite members of society in North Korea being shot by artillery at point-blank range by the personal order of the country's leader before it was revealed that said individuals weren't actually dead or missing, of Russia hacking the US elections and deciding who the next leader of the United States will be with the press of a few buttons, as well as many other ridiculous fakes and blatant lies which receive no opposition or question within the Western media sphere. And in every single instance, you always have the same rat pack of Western politicians and leaders immediately jumping on the media train. You have French President Emmanuel Macron, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, members of the US State Department, all talking about this event on the very first day. That is to say, hours after the allegation was simply put out and absolutely no evidence has even remotely been provided, whether that evidence is fake or otherwise, then frankly, all of that begins to look like a massive red flag. And I truly hate to say this, but going off of various precedents, this fake will most likely never be admitted to. Just like the alleged chemical attacks by the Syrian government, which were used to immediately justify sending hundreds of cruise missiles to bomb the country and kill its people. Just like these ridiculous tales of people allegedly being poisoned and surviving a chemical weapon of mass destruction, and were never admitted to or even as much as hinted to as being the blatant falsehood that they clearly are, even 5 years down the line. Just as all of that transpired, unfortunately, I do not think that this narrative of the Bucha massacre will ever be unveiled or exposed, at least not in mainstream Western political discourse. And speaking of mainstream Western political discourse, I will also mention how it is incredibly interesting to see that not in a single country outside the Western world, outside of this empire of lies that is the collective West, do we see a single popular politician or mainstream political party jumping on this bandwagon of Russia bad, Russia's at fault, Russia massacre. Only political members of the collective West are doing this, which is yet more evidence that all of this is nothing but a Western media campaign. And this is where I have to say that I truly hope that the end goal of this media campaign is only to demonize Russia and nothing else. I truly hope that all of these politicians who are eating all of this up are not stupid enough to think that Russia is some Syria, which they can bomb with cruise missiles over such allegations. Because realistically speaking, there are no more sanctions, not any significant sanctions at least, that the West can put on Russia. There is also nothing that the collective West can do militarily besides what it is already doing. That is, unless of course the collective West decides to do something drastic which will lead to devastating consequences and will bring us up the ladder of escalation to a potential nuclear war. I truly hope that that does not happen. Though for what it's worth, I believe that the probability of something like that happening is low. I think so because this media campaign was ignited not by the media of the collective West, but by the Ukrainian government. And the Ukrainian government, facing the prospect of a complete annihilation on the battlefield and a war which it has no hope of winning in the long term, does indeed want a massive escalation to happen so that they have a chance at survival. We have already seen this from their incessant calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Not to mention that they stand to gain from solidifying their own public opinion against Russia, therefore making it that much more difficult for Russia to control the country or parts of the country in the future. And that is all I have to say for now, at least, about the alleged Bucha massacre. One final thing that I will mention before I sign off is that we will likely see many more media campaigns and provocations of this nature before this conflict is over. It is the sad reality that Western corporate media has already decided long ago who the enemy is. And they will do absolutely everything in their power to demonize not just Russia, but all of their geopolitical adversaries before the rest of the world. They do not care about objective investigations in their reports. They do not care about the truth. And that is why they are called the Empire of Lies. And one very last thing that I would like to say before I sign off is please check out my Rumble channel. If anything happens to my YouTube channel, which I certainly hope doesn't happen, I hope that I am being paranoid about this. But if something does happen, then I will only be able to put out my videos on alternative platforms, such as Rumble. As always, the link to that will be in the video description, along with the archive that I am compiling, which contains various footage and information about this war.